June 17, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon.
Let me tell you something that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. On that Monday morning, as most of the world was still digesting the weekend's headlines, another NATO summit, another round of sanctions, another drone strike in the Middle East, something far more consequential happened in the Caribbean. The Venezuelan government, in a move that was either breathtakingly bold or suicidally reckless, announced the seizure of a major offshore gas field operated by a consortium of Western energy firms.
Not just any gas field. This one.
The Dragon Field, as it's called, sits in a disputed maritime zone between Venezuela and Guyana, an area that's been a simmering flashpoint for years. But here's the field isn't just rich in hydrocarbons.
It's strategic. It's the kind of asset that doesn't just fill government coffers, it reshapes regional power dynamics. And the timing?
Oh, the timing couldn't have been worse.
Or better, depending on who you ask.
I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy, geopolitics, and great power competition. I've written books on resource wars, advised governments on sanctions regimes, and watched as one after another, the same patterns repeat themselves.
And let me be, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some impulsive move by a desperate regime.
This was a calculated gamble, one that could either secure Venezuela's survival or accelerate its collapse in ways we haven't seen since the fall of the Soviet Union.
But here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you. This isn't just about oil. It's not even just about Guyana.
This is about the United States, China, Russia, and a global order that's cracking under the weight of its own contradictions.
And Venezuela?
They just handed Washington the perfect excuse to do something it's been itching to do for years.
The official what they want you to believe.
If you've been following the news, here's the story you've been. Venezuela, a rogue state under the thumb of Nicolas Maduro, has once again violated international law by seizing assets in a disputed territory. The Dragon Field, operated by ExxonMobil in partnership with Hess and the Chinese state-owned CNOOC, was producing nearly 600,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day, enough to make a dent in global energy markets. Maduro's government claims the field lies within Venezuela's maritime borders, citing a 19th-century arbitration award that Guyana rejects.
The U.S. State Department called the move illegal and provocative. The UN Security Council held an emergency session.
The White House issued a statement warning of severe consequences.
The data seems to back this up.
Venezuela's economy is in shambles. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless, and millions have fled the country.
Maduro's regime is isolated, sanctioned, and desperate for cash.
Seizing the Dragon Field, the narrative goes, is a last-ditch effort to shore up his government's finances before the next round of elections. It's classic strongman distract the population with a nationalist rallying cry, blame foreign powers for your problems, and hope the oil money keeps the military loyal. The media has framed this as another chapter in the long saga of Venezuelan decline.
The New York Times ran a piece titled "Maduro's Desperate Stealing Guyana's Oil." The Economist called it a dictator's Hail Mary. Even some Latin America experts I respect have described this as a move of sheer desperation, a sign that Maduro is cornered and lashing out. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's too neat.
It ignores the geopolitical chessboard. It assumes that Maduro is acting alone, without patrons, without a larger strategy.
And most dangerously, it assumes that the U.S. response will be measured, rational, and contained. That's not how this works.
That's not how any of this works.
Deconstructing the official what's really happening. Let's start with the basics. The Dragon Field isn't just any oil asset.
It's part of the Stabroek Block, a massive offshore reserve that ExxonMobil has been developing since 2015. The block is estimated to hold 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil, enough to make Guyana one of the world's top oil producers within a decade.
For a country of 800,000 people, that's a game changer.
For Venezuela, a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves but whose production has collapsed due to mismanagement and sanctions, it's an existential threat.
Now, here's where things get interesting.
The U.S. has been quietly backing Guyana in this dispute for years.
Not just diplomatically, militarily. In 2020,
the U.S. Southern Command conducted joint exercises with the Guyanese military. In 2022, the U.S. sent a Coast Guard cutter to patrol Guyanese waters. And just last month, the Biden administration approved a $500 million military aid package for Guyana, including radar systems, drones, and most significantly, anti-ship missiles.
Why? Because Guyana is the perfect proxy.
It's a small, English-speaking democracy with no history of anti-Americanism. It's a member of the Caribbean community, which gives the U.S. plausible deniability, oh, we're just supporting our regional partners.
And most importantly, it's sitting on a lot of oil. But here's the part the media isn't talking: China and Russia are already in Guyana. CNOOC, the Chinese state-owned oil giant, has a 25% stake in the Stabroek block. Russia's Rosneft has been sniffing around Guyana's energy sector for years.
And just last year, Guyana's government signed a $1.5 billion infrastructure deal with China, part of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative.
So when Maduro seized the Dragon field, he wasn't just poking the US. He was poking China and Russia too.
And that's where the official narrative falls apart. If this were just about Maduro being desperate, he would have targeted a purely Western asset.
But he didn't. He went after a field with Chinese ownership. That's not desperation, that's coordination. Because here's what no one in Washington wants to: Maduro isn't acting alone. He's got backers. And those backers have very different interests than the US. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying these kinds of: when a small, sanctioned country makes a move this bold, it's never just about them. It's about the great powers pulling the strings. And in this case, the strings lead to Moscow and Beijing. The great power. Why this is bigger than Venezuela. This isn't just a Latin American story. This is a global story. And if you want to understand why, you need to step back and look at the bigger picture. We are in the middle of a fundamental shift in the international order. The unipolar moment, the brief period after the Cold War when the US was the sole superpower, is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where power is distributed among multiple Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and regional players like India, Turkey, and Iran. The US doesn't like this. Not one bit. For the last 30 years, American foreign policy has been built on one core: that the US can and should maintain global hegemony.
That it can shape the world in its image, enforce its rules, and punish those who don't comply. That it can contain China, isolate Russia, and keep the global South in line.
But that assumption is collapsing.
And Venezuela's move on the Dragon field is just the latest symptom of that collapse.
Let's break it down. 1. The US. This is our backyard. For Washington, Latin America has always been sacrosanct. The Monroe Doctrine, America for the Americans, isn't just a relic of the 19th century. It's living policy. And right now, the US sees Latin America slipping away. China's over the last decade, China has become the top trading partner for most of Latin America. It's built ports in AMA, railroads in Argentina, and 5G networks in Brazil. It's lent hundreds of billions of dollars to governments across the region, often with fewer strings attached than Western institutions like the IMF. Russia's Moscow has been quietly rebuilding its influence, too. It's sold arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. It's sent Wagner Group mercenaries to Haiti. And it's used its UN Security Council veto to shield Maduro from international pressure. The Pink Tide 2.0, leftist governments are back in power across Latin America: Lula in Brazil, Petro in Colombia, AMLO in Mexico. These leaders aren't Soviet-style communists, but they're not pro-American either. They want autonomy. And that terrifies Washington. So when Maduro seizes a major oil field in a US-backed country, it's not just an economic move. It's a geopolitical one. It's a test. Can the US still enforce its will in its own hemisphere? Or is the Monroe Doctrine dead? 2. The Chinese. This is our energy security. China doesn't care about democracy in Latin America. It cares about three things: resources, markets, and denying the US dominance. The Dragon field is a strategic asset for Beijing. Here's Energy. China is the world's largest oil importer. It needs stable, diversified sources of energy. And right now, too much of its oil comes from the Middle East, a region dominated by US military power. Latin America is a hedge against that vulnerability. The yuan's China has been pushing for oil to be priced in yuan, not dollars. If it can get Latin American producers to accept yuan for oil, it weakens the dollar's dominance. And that's a direct threat to US financial power. Belt and Road. China has invested billions in Latin America. If it can control key energy assets, it can control the governments that depend on them. That's how you build a sphere of influence. So when Maduro seizes a field with Chinese ownership, Beijing has to abandon its investment or double down. And China doesn't abandon investments. 3. The Russian. This is our chance to bleed America. Russia doesn't have China's economic clout. But it has something, just as the ability to create chaos. Moscow's playbook is make the US overstretch. Force Washington to spend blood and treasure in places it doesn't want to. And right now, Latin America is low-hanging fruit. Venezuela is Russia's. Moscow has been propping up Maduro for years. It sold him arms, sent him mercenaries, and helped him evade sanctions. Why? Because Venezuela is a thorn in America's side. And the more the US is distracted by Venezuela, the less it can focus on Ukraine. The Cuba. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union used Cuba as a proxy to pressure the US. Now, Russia is doing the same with Venezuela. It's not about winning. It's about costing the US more than it's worth. Energy. As a Russia has been using energy as a geopolitical tool for decades. If it can help Venezuela control key oil and gas assets, it can disrupt global markets. And in a world where energy prices drive inflation, that's a powerful weapon. So when Maduro makes a move like this, Russia isn't just a bystander. It's cheering from the sidelines. Because every time the US gets dragged into another crisis, Russia wins. The military. How close are we to war? Now, let's talk about the real elephant in the military escalation. The US has already deployed assets to the region. The USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group is conducting routine exercises in the Caribbean. The US has sent F-22s to Guyana. And the Pentagon has quietly activated contingency plans for a potential Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. But here's the: this isn't Iraq. This isn't Afghanistan. This is Latin America, America's backyard. And the rules are different here. 1. The US can't afford another forever war. The American public is exhausted from 2 decades of war in the Middle East. The last thing they want is another conflict, especially one that doesn't directly threaten US soil. And yet, that's exactly where we're headed. Mission creep is: if the US sends troops to Guyana, it won't be a limited operation. It'll be a long-term commitment. Because once you're in, you can't leave without looking weak. The Pottery Barn rule. Remember Colin Powell's famous line? You break it, you own it. If the US invades Venezuela, it owns Venezuela. And that means nation building, counterinsurgency, and another quagmire. The China-Russia. If the US gets bogged down in Venezuela, China and Russia will exploit it. China will push harder in the South China Sea. Russia will push harder in Ukraine. And the US will be stretched too thin to respond. 2. Venezuela isn't defenseless. Maduro's military is a shadow of what it once was, but it's not powerless. Asymmetric. Venezuela has thousands of Cuban and Russian advisors. It has missiles that can hit US ships. It has cyber capabilities that can disrupt US communications. And it has allies that can make life very difficult for the US. The Cuba 1962. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? When the US blockaded Cuba, the Soviets almost escalated to nuclear war. Venezuela isn't Cuba, but the principle is the small countries can punch above their weight when they have great power backers. The Afghanistan. The US thought it could quickly topple the Taliban in 2001. 20 years later, it lost. Venezuela isn't Afghanistan, but the hubris is the same. 3. The escalation ladder is very slippery. Right now, the US is trying to thread the pressure Venezuela without triggering a war.
But that's much harder than it sounds.
Sanctions won't. The US has been sanctioning Venezuela for years. It hasn't worked. Why? Because China and Russia are happy to buy Venezuelan oil.
Military strikes are a terrible. Bombing Venezuelan oil facilities might cripple production temporarily, but it'll also unify the country behind Maduro.
And it'll give China and Russia an excuse to retaliate.
Regime change is a fantasy. The US has been trying to oust Maduro for years.
It hasn't worked. Why? Because he's not Saddam Hussein. He's got real support among the military and the poor. And even if he falls, what comes next? Another strongman? A civil war? Chaos? The bottom line? There is no good military option. And yet, that's exactly what some in Washington are pushing for. The domestic political. Why this is about more than geopolitics. Here's something that doesn't get enough. Foreign policy is domestic policy. Every major foreign policy decision in the US is also a domestic political calculation. And right now, the Biden administration is under pressure on multiple fronts. 1. The 2024 election looms. Biden is in a tight race against Trump. And right now, foreign policy is a liability.
The weak on China Republicans are hammering Biden for being soft on China.
If he doesn't respond forcefully to Venezuela's move, they'll call him weak.
The energy crisis. Gas prices are rising again.
If Venezuela disrupts oil supplies, it'll hurt Biden's re-election chances.
And the GOP will blame him. The border crisis. The US southern border is chaos.
If Venezuela starts weaponizing migration, it'll dominate the news cycle.
So Biden has to do nothing and look weak, or act and risk a quagmire.
2. The neocons are back. Remember the neoconservatives? The folks who brought us Iraq? They're back and they're pushing for action.
Victoria Nuland's, the same person who helped orchestrate the 2014 Ukraine coup, is now a key player in Latin America policy. And she's not known for her restaurant. The democracy promotion. There's a strong faction in Washington that believes the US must intervene to save Venezuela.
They don't care about the costs.
They care about the principle.
The military-industrial war is profitable.
And right now, defense contractors are salivating at the prospect of another conflict.
3. The progressive backlash.
But there's another faction in the Democratic, the progressives.
And they're furious. AOC. Now, what most people don't realize is that the progressive backlash isn't just about moral opposition to intervention, it's about cold, hard electoral math.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad aren't just tweeting about imperialism, they're reminding Biden that his 2020 coalition was built on young voters and Latinos, two groups that would abandon him in droves if he greenlit another regime change war in Latin America. Remember, in 2020, Biden won Arizona by just over 10,000 votes, and Florida by a razor-thin margin before Trump flipped it in 2020.
The Venezuelan American vote in Miami-Dade County alone could swing the state.
And right now, the Venezuelan diaspora is deeply divided. Some want Maduro gone at any cost, others remember the chaos of the 2002 coup and the failed sanctions.
If Biden sides with the neocons, he risks alienating both sides. But here's the uncomfortable: the domestic political pressure isn't just coming from the left or the right. It's coming from the center, too. The same pundits who spent the last decade lecturing us about strategic patience with North Korea or restraint in Syria are now demanding immediate action on Guyana. Why? Because Guyana isn't Syria. It's not a far-off conflict with no clear U.S. interest.
It's right on America's doorstep, in a region where the Monroe Doctrine still carries weight, whether we like it or not. And when you combine that with the fact that ExxonMobil has already sunk billions into Guyana's offshore oil fields that Venezuela is now threatening, you start to see why the calculus changes. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines.
The Essequibo dispute isn't just about oil. It's about the future of U.S. military posture in the Western Hemisphere.
For decades, the Pentagon has treated Latin America as a secondary theater, focusing on counter-narcotics operations and occasional humanitarian missions.
But if Venezuela makes a move on Guyana, that changes. Suddenly, the U.S. Southern Command, which has been chronically underfunded compared to Indo-Pacific or European commands, would be thrust into the spotlight. And here's the U.S. military is not prepared for a conventional conflict in South America. Think about it. The last time the U.S. fought a major land war in Latin America was AMA in 1989. Since then, the focus has been on counterinsurgency in the Middle East and great power competition with China and Russia. The U.S. has no permanent bases in Guyana, no pre-positioned stockpiles, and no clear allies in the region willing to host large-scale U.S. forces. Brazil, the regional heavyweight, has made it clear it won't get involved. Colombia, the U.S.'s closest partner in South America, is dealing with its own internal instability and has no interest in opening a second front against Venezuela. That leaves the U.S. with either a massive airlift of troops and equipment, something the military hasn't done at scale since the Gulf War, or a reliance on naval power, which would mean blockading Venezuela's coast. Now, a blockade sounds simple, but it's anything but. Venezuela has one of the most heavily fortified coastlines in the region, thanks to years of Russian and Iranian arms sales. They've got anti-ship missiles, coastal defense systems, and a navy that, while outdated, is still capable of harassing U.S. vessels. And let's not forget that Venezuela has been conducting joint exercises with Russia and Iran for years. In 2022, Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela as part of a show of force. In 2023, Iran sent warships to Venezuelan ports. This isn't just posturing. It's a signal that if the U.S. tries to enforce a blockade, it won't just be fighting Venezuela, it'll be risking a direct confrontation with two of its biggest adversaries. Here's where things get really messy. The U.S. could try to degrade Venezuela's military capabilities with airstrikes, but that would require a level of precision and intelligence that the U.S. hasn't had to deploy in Latin America since the Cold War. Venezuela's air defenses are a patchwork of Russian S-300 systems and older Soviet-era equipment, but they're still capable of shooting down U.S. aircraft. And even if the U.S. could neutralize Venezuela's air defenses, what then? The U.S. would be bombing a country with 30 million people, many of whom would see this as an act of imperialism. The humanitarian fallout would be catastrophic, and the political blowback would be immediate. But the military implications go beyond just the immediate conflict. If the U.S. intervenes in Guyana, it would set a precedent that could unravel decades of regional diplomacy. The Organization of American States has already condemned Venezuela's actions, but it's a toothless body. The real power in the region is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which has been notably silent on the Essequibo dispute. Why? Because many of its members, including Mexico, Argentina, and Bolivia, see this as a U.S.-Venezuela issue, not a regional one. If the U.S. acts unilaterally, it would confirm every suspicion that Washington still sees Latin America as its backyard, not a collection of sovereign nations. And then there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, investing in infrastructure, buying up commodities, and selling arms. Venezuela is one of China's closest allies in the region, and if the U.S. intervenes, China will have a golden opportunity to position itself as the defender of Latin American sovereignty. We've already seen this playbook in the Middle East, where China has used U.S. interventions to build alliances with countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. If the U.S. gets bogged down in a conflict in Guyana, China will be there to offer an alternative, a non-interventionist, economically focused partnership that many Latin American leaders would find appealing. So where does that leave us? The Biden administration is caught between a rock and a hard place. Do nothing, and they look weak in the face of a direct challenge to U.S. interests. Act, and they risk a quagmire that could destabilize the region, alienate key allies, and hand China a strategic victory. The neocons are pushing for action, the progressives are warning against it, and the military is quietly preparing for the worst. But here's this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the future of U.S. power in Latin America. For decades, the U.S. has treated the region as an afterthought, focusing on Europe and Asia while assuming that Latin America would always be in its sphere of influence. But that assumption is being tested. Venezuela's move on Guyana is a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and how the U.S. responds will determine whether that hegemony holds or whether it starts to crumble.
Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just playing out on the international stage, it's tearing Venezuela apart from the inside. Maduro's government is walking a razor's edge, and the Essequibo gambit is as much about domestic survival as it is about territorial ambition. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is a shell of what it was in the 1990s. Oil production, once the lifeblood of the country, has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, less than half of what it was under Chavez in 2013. Inflation, which peaked at an almost incomprehensible 1,700,000% in 2018, has stabilized only because the government effectively dollarized parts of the economy, but that's a band-aid on a gaping wound. The bolivar is worthless, public services are in tatters, and according to the UN, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015. That's nearly a quarter of the population. So why, in the middle of this economic catastrophe, would Maduro pick a fight with Guyana? Because he needs a distraction, and not just any distraction, but one that rallies nationalist sentiment. Here's the uncomfortable: the regime's legitimacy has been eroding for years. The 2018 presidential election was widely condemned as a sham, with the opposition boycotting and international observers like the OAS and EU refusing to recognize the results. The 2020 parliamentary elections were even worse, with the government stacking the Electoral Council and arresting opposition leaders. Maduro's approval ratings, according to Dataanalysis, have hovered around 15% for years. That's not a sustainable level for a government that rules through coercion rather than consent. But nationalism is the one card Maduro can still play. The Essequibo dispute isn't new, it dates back to the 19th century, when Venezuela and British Guiana first clashed over the region. The US even got involved in 1895, with Secretary of State Richard Olney invoking the Monroe Doctrine to pressure Britain into arbitration. The resulting 1899 Paris Arbitral Award gave most of the territory to British Guiana, but Venezuela never fully accepted it. Fast forward to 1966, when Guyana gained independence, and Venezuela immediately revived its claim, arguing that the arbitration was flawed. The dispute has simmered ever since, but it's never been a priority for Venezuelans until now. Maduro's timing is no accident. In 2023, Guyana's oil boom turned the Essequibo from a historical footnote into a potential economic lifeline. ExxonMobil's discovery of massive offshore reserves in 2015, estimated at over 11 billion barrels, has transformed Guyana into the world's fastest-growing economy, with GDP surging by 62% in 2022 alone. For a Venezuelan government desperate for revenue, the idea of controlling even a fraction of that wealth is intoxicating. But more importantly, it's a narrative that Maduro can sell to a population that has lost faith in his leadership. The regime has gone all in on this. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum where voters were asked 5 questions, all designed to stoke nationalist fervor. Did they reject the 1899 arbitration? Yes. Did they support creating a new Venezuelan state in Essequibo? Yes. Did they back granting Venezuelan citizenship to the region's residents? Yes. The government claimed over 10 million people participated, with 95% approval on all questions. Independent observers, including the opposition, dismissed the results as fraudulent, pointing out that the turnout was suspiciously high given Venezuela's political apathy. But the optics were Maduro, standing in front of a giant map of Venezuela with Essequibo reincorporated, declaring victory. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. The referendum wasn't just about public relations, it was a legal and military threat. By claiming that the Venezuelan people had approved the annexation of Essequibo, Maduro is trying to create a fait accompli. The government has already started issuing oil exploration licenses in the disputed waters, and in April 2024, it announced the creation of a new military command for the region, complete with airstrips and naval bases. The message is Venezuela is not backing down. But this strategy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's working domestically. Polls show that support for the Essequibo claim has surged, even among opposition voters. The regime has framed this as a patriotic duty, and in a country where dissent is met with imprisonment or exile, few are willing to openly oppose it. The opposition, led by figures like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, has been forced into an awkward position.
They can't outright reject the Essequibo claim, doing so would be political suicide, but they also can't endorse Maduro's militaristic approach without alienating their base. So they've tried to thread the needle, arguing that the dispute should be resolved through international law, not force. It's a weak stance, and Maduro has already accused them of being traitors in the pay of Guyana and the US. On the other hand, this strategy is pushing Venezuela into a corner. The more Maduro escalates, the harder it becomes for him to back down without losing face. And if he does back down, say, after US or international pressure, he risks looking weak in front of his own military, which is the only institution keeping him in power. That's why I'm convinced that Maduro's endgame isn't actually to take Essequibo. It's to use the threat of conflict to extract concessions, sanctions relief, debt restructuring, or even a power-sharing deal with the opposition. The problem is that once you start playing with fire, you don't always get to choose when it stops burning. Let's talk about the military, because that's where this gets really messy. The Venezuelan armed forces are not the same institution they were under Chavez. Back then, the military was a revolutionary force, ideologically aligned with the Bolivarian project. Today, it's a fractured, corrupt, and increasingly desperate organization. Senior officers have been implicated in drug trafficking, gold smuggling, and human rights abuses. The rank and file are underpaid, under-equipped, and demoralized. In 2023, the government had to crack down on a mutiny in the National Guard after soldiers protested over unpaid wages. That's not the kind of military you want leading a war. But Maduro has no choice but to rely on them. The military is the only thing standing between him and a coup or a popular uprising. That's why he's been so careful to keep them on side. In 2020, he promoted over 500 officers to general rank, a record number, many of them with ties to the drug trade or the colectivos, the armed pro-government militias. He's also given the military control over key economic sectors, including oil, mining, and food distribution. The generals aren't just loyal to Maduro, they're invested in his survival. The problem is that the military's interests don't always align with Maduro's. If the Essequibo crisis escalates, the generals will be the ones on the front lines. They know that Venezuela's military is no match for the US or even Guyana's growing defense partnerships with Brazil and the UK. They also know that a war would be unpopular, especially if it drags on. So while they'll publicly support Maduro's rhetoric, behind the now, let's project some scenarios. The most likely outcome, in my view, is a prolonged standoff with periodic escalations but no full-scale war. Maduro will keep ratcheting up the pressure, military exercises near the border, cyber attacks on Guyana's oil infrastructure, maybe even a limited incursion to seize a small piece of territory. The goal won't be to conquer Essequibo but to force Guyana and the US to the negotiating table. If he can extract sanctions relief or a favorable deal on debt, he'll declare victory and pivot back to domestic issues. But there are two wildcards that could change everything. The first is the opposition. If Machado or Gonzalez can unite the anti-Maduro forces and present a credible alternative, the regime's narrative of us versus them starts to fall apart. The Essequibo dispute is a unifying issue for now, but if the opposition can shift the conversation back to the economy, corruption, and the humanitarian crisis, Maduro's grip could weaken. The problem is that the opposition is deeply divided, and the government has already jailed or exiled many of its leaders. The 2024 presidential election is shaping up to be another sham, but if the opposition can mobilize enough pressure, through protests, international sanctions, or even a general strike, it could force Maduro into a corner. The second wildcard is the military itself. If the generals start to believe that Maduro is leading them into a disaster, they could turn on him. That's what happened in 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and was briefly recognized by the US and over 50 other countries. The military didn't abandon Maduro then, but if the crisis deepens, that calculus could change. The generals might decide that a negotiated transition is preferable to a war they can't win. Alternatively, they could double down, purging dissenters and consolidating power under a new strongman. Either way, the military will be the kingmaker. The worst-case scenario is a miscalculation. Maduro, desperate to shore up his support, could order a limited military operation in Essequibo, expecting the US to blink. But if the US responds with force, say, a naval blockade or airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets, all bets are off.
Venezuela's air defenses are outdated, and its navy is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s. A US intervention would be swift and decisive, but it would also trigger a regional crisis.
Brazil, which shares a border with both Venezuela and Guyana, would be forced to take sides.
Colombia, which has its own history of conflict with Venezuela, might see an opportunity to weaken Maduro.
And China, which has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, would have to decide whether to back its ally or cut its losses.
Here's the bottom: Venezuela's Essequibo gambit is a high-stakes game of chicken, and Maduro is betting that the US and Guyana will swerve first.
He's probably right, but the risk of a crash is real. Domestically, the crisis is a temporary lifeline for a regime that has run out of options. Internationally, it's a test of US resolve and a potential opening for China.
And for the people of Venezuela, it's just another chapter in a long, painful decline.
The question now is whether anyone is willing to call Maduro's bluff.
Because if they don't, we could be looking at the first major interstate conflict in South America in decades, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the banks of the Essequibo River.